So let's kick off. Our first speaker this evening is Richard Gerver. Richard will be sharing his thoughts on our human response to change, how that relates to the current uncertainty we're living through, and he'll talk about some of the ways we can feel a little more in control, and crucially, the vision we can consider for our children as they and we move beyond this pandemic. So, Richard, if you're there, I'll hand over to you.
Great. Thank you very much. Good evening, everybody. Thank you for taking the time out to join us for what I think is going to be an incredible week after what must have been a taxing day after many other taxing days. Just to let you know, I'm currently in my broom cupboard in Derby. And it's been quite a taxing day here, not for me, for my wife. She's a school principal. In the day so far today, she's had to deal with a year 5 child test positive, a dinner supervisor test positive, send 2-year groups home, and the school next door to her is burnt down this morning. So just an average day in the life of an educator at the moment. And really, it's here that I want to start. I want to spend the 20 minutes or so that I've got with you this evening to really look at the huge amplified challenge and stuff we're dealing with both now and as we head into the future on a very human level. And I don't think we really can start any conversation in the current climate without just spending a few minutes thinking about how we personally have coped with the unbelievable challenge that people have been facing over the last few months and what looks like it's going to be months to come. So I want to take you back, and I want to start on a very personal footing for me from when this thing really started to hit us all as being as profound and serious as it turned out it was going to become. For me, it was the end of February. I'd come back from a work trip to Australia and came home. And it was interesting because in Australia, being that much closer linked to China, there was a huge amount on the news at that time about what was going on and how this pandemic was spreading. But even when I got back to the UK at the end of February, I was still thinking, well, kind of, it's a problem in the distance. And then, of course, it hit us all around mid-March. And I don't know how you reacted, but when the reality first hit us full on, I think I went into a kind of state of paralysis. Nothing went in, really. I was just listening to the information and it was flowing through one ear, out the other. It was buffeting off me. I just kind of froze in terms of personal and professional response. And then after a short while, I kind of went into that phase of denial, though I won't come here. It won't be as bad as they're saying it's going to be. It'll be over relatively quickly. We'll be traveling on holiday by the time we get to Easter and then the summer. And when that didn't happen, I guess I became quite angry. If I'm honest, I was angry at the government, angry at the media, angry at my next door neighbor who was having more people round than they should have done. And when that didn't make me feel any better, I think I slipped into a stage that'll be familiar to so many of us, which was kind of one of lethargy, of stress, almost a mild kind of depression, I think, a listlessness, when it suddenly hit me that actually there just didn't seem to be any levers that I could pull to gain back a semblance of control. And I think that's where that feeling of mild stress and kind of a tepid depression came from. And I think what's really important to recognize is the 4 stages I've just talked about aren't just stages that some of us have lived through in the last few months, but actually describe the way many people feel about profound moments of change when that change is something that's done to them, when they feel they have no control over the processes that they're living through. And in some ways, it's also not only how we feel as educators, so often buffeted by stuff that's being done to us, but also sometimes the way some of our students can feel when we're pushing them beyond their comfort zones. And really, the key is as quickly as we can, and if we can, to find a way to start to be able to pull small levers of control, to get some of that control back. You know, one of the things we know about mild stress is it tends to come on when you feel you have no control over your life. And I suppose for educators, profoundly now, but always, there's always been that feeling that somebody else is doing it to us. And the trick really is, as quickly as we can, to start to find a way to fire our curiosity, to engage by starting to question, to be interested in what's happening, and to try and find constructive pathways to allow us to feel in small ways we have little bits of control. On a professional and personal footing for me, as somebody that now spends most of my life traveling around and speaking at events, it was really just taking an interest in this, in Zoom, in digital media, to try and find a vehicle and a way to continue to be able to communicate. And instantly, although not a lot changed, I started to feel better because I started to feel I was being more proactive and less reactive in the moment and in the process. And eventually that led to that feeling of activation, that feeling that actually I can do something, I can be involved in a process moving forwards. And I think on that note, there's another reflection I want to share with you. And really the best way I can explain it is to tell you about a story from here. This is the world's first Starbucks in Seattle. I don't know if any of you have been there, but I was there a few years ago. Again, I was working, I had a day off, and I thought, I've got to visit the world's first Starbucks. Not necessarily for me, but I wanted to take a picture so my daughter could see how cool I was and that she could share that picture with her friends, so all her friends realized that I was the coolest dad on the block. I think it happens to fathers of a certain age with teenage daughters, this obsession with having to be the coolest parent. Anyway, I decided to queue up outside the world's first Starbucks to get myself a coffee, have a photograph, and become an Instagram hero. And it turns out that every other father in Seattle on the same day had decided to do the same thing, because the queue outside this Starbucks went back for a mile and a half. But I love my daughter, so I decided it was time to queue, and I did. And everything was fine. I was quite excited, quite looking forward to having my Starbucks from the world's first Starbucks, until I got to where I took this picture. Because at the point at which I took this picture, I could hear what was going on inside the coffee shop. Now, for those of you that don't know me, I am an incredibly simple person, and that's defined by my coffee. I drink my coffee black. I don't even know the names for the cups still, in a kind of medium-sized cup. So when I go to a coffee shop like this and the barista says, "What would you like?" I just say, "A cup of black coffee, please," about this big. And that's what I was going to do here. But then things started to get twitchy because of what was going on in the store. Because by the time you got to where I was when I took this picture, you could hear the orders inside. And the thing was, people didn't seem to be ordering coffee. It seemed to be some version of slam poetry. It was extraordinary. It was the people were reeling off 15, 20, 25 things they wanted done to this liquid. They wanted a choco mocha breve half and half with caramel syrup that was sugar-free. And every order ended with kind of the punctuation point of, "And I'd like it extra hot, please." Well, look, call me simple, but a cup of coffee is a cup. Someone needs to explain to me the extra hot thing. Anyway, at the end of each order, because I guess we're in America, the baristas and everyone else in the line's whooping as they're hearing the artistry and poetic quality of these orders. People, "Way to go, great order, yes." And I'm thinking, in a minute, I'm going to go up to the barista and I'm going to say, "Can I have a cup of black coffee, please, in this sort of size cup?" Anyway, I couldn't bear the humiliation. So having waited for over an hour, I turned around and ran away. And as I was running away, I thought to myself, in some ways, this kind of typifies what we're dealing with in the world right now. in the belief that everything has to be incredibly complicated to be of value. And one of the things that's worried me over the last couple of decades within education, and what profoundly worries me now as we start to come to grips with the legacy of COVID, whenever that legacy might be, is the concern that we're going to try and overcomplicate stuff, that we're going to look for complex solutions within education. And it does worry me at the moment. There is so much material out there, so many things that as a profession, teachers are being told they have to understand around cognitive science, around all kinds of other issues. And I'm not saying it's not good material, but I do worry that in this age of uncertainty and change, we're just going to continue to overcomplicate what maybe needs to be stripped back to the basics of what makes great education at any time, and particularly in an era, hopefully down the line as we move beyond COVID. You know, I wonder, for those of you that have logged on, I wonder how many of you have lived through how many new initiatives have you lived through in your time in education? People selling stuff, coming up with the concept, the answer, the silver bullet. I wonder how many of you have been in schools crammed full of silver bullets, of new ideas that have come and gone and come and gone, and actually to an extent disenfranchised so many of us and created skeptics and exhausted professionals. And I wonder how many of you have lived in this climate where actually you get to a point where you start to doubt your own professionalism, your own instincts, your own relationships and knowledge of your students. And in a way, that's where the complexity bleeds back into everything we do. So in the short time I've got with you, what I'd like to do is take things back and just look at things in simple terms and see how many of those things are going to be relevant as we continue to fight through this and hopefully come out the other side. And let me start here with vision. Because in many ways, what we continue to do in education is pile stuff on top of everything else we're already doing. And although sometimes we talk about change and transformation in education, lessons we can learn from the horrific period of time we're living through in human history right now, we often just try and intervene by making what we already do more and more and more and more and more efficient. And the truth is, as we think about the future, as we map out that future for our children and future generations, children that are going to be living in a very different world to the one that both we were raised in and the one we lived in even before COVID. And we have to go back to a foundational vision about, so what is it we're here to do? Now, a couple of years ago, I had the chance to meet with an extraordinary human being, Schmidt, who was the former, until recently actually, the executive chairman of Google. Now, don't ask me how I managed to blag myself lunch with Schmidt, but there you go. And it was a couple of years ago in London, and we're sat down and I'm tucking into steak and wine, and he's eating lettuce and water because he's from California and his body's a temple. Anyway, we're sat there. And we started talking about a number of things. And I began the conversation by asking him, I suppose, quite a general question, something that's interested me for a very long time. And it was this. I said, Eric, as executive chairman of Google, as somebody that's been in and around technology all his life, I want to know, do you ever see a time where technology will replace the teacher? And his answer was immediate and unequivocal and really quite surprising. Because what he said was, from a man at the height of technology, was no, never. I said, why? He said, technology is incredible. It's an unbelievable catalyst. It's a tool. It's an incredible vehicle for democratization. But he said, education is and always has been about the development of human beings. And to develop human beings, you will always need high levels of human interaction. And technology will never be able to replace that. And I think that's really important for us to think about, again, as we think about the mass complexity and the technical stuff that's being thrown at us all the time, to remember that fundamental point, that education is about the development of human beings first and foremost. Which brings me to the second point, which was this. I went on, now I was feeling comfortable in his company, and I asked him the question, what do you think is the biggest challenge you've faced in your time at Google? He said, really, Richard, it's very simple. He said, when I arrived at Google, I was brought in by Larry Page and Sergey Brin, the two founders. Brilliant, brilliant guys. But they didn't know how to run a business. They had just created this philosophical and brilliant internet provision, founded on their foundational vision, which was to organize the world's information, to make it accessible for everybody, and by so doing diminish evil. He said they brought me in to help them turn Google into a business. And up until that point, he'd been the CEO at Hewlett-Packard. He said, when I started at Google, it was the most extraordinary place I'd ever worked in my life. He said it was like an ideas factory. He said every corridor, every room you went in, people were having excited conversations about how we could catalyze the vision, how we could crystallize it, how we could organize the world's information, make it accessible for everybody, and by so doing, diminish evil. He said people were springing up with ideas all over the place. He said, I remember one conversation that had been instigated by one of the creative directors, and she'd gathered a group of people around her, and she was saying, how could we map the world in images so that anyone could visit anywhere in the world from their desktop or laptop computer? And of course, what came out of that was Google Earth. He said the greatest challenge we faced, weirdly, has been our success. He said, the more successful we've become, the more the nature of those meetings have changed, the more we've gone from being proactive to being reactive. He said, all of a sudden, meetings have been about, have you seen what Microsoft are working on, or Facebook, or this Twitter thing, or Apple? He said, when I look at our short history and the greatest disasters we've come across, they've always been where we've stopped believing in our vision, our values, and our talent, and started to react to what other people were doing. And again, I think to an extent, that's something that we've been pressured into within education for all kinds of reasons. And one of them, of course, is because of the political pressure put on us through the reports published by the OECD. And we all know whenever a lot of educators see the OECD, our blood runs cold a bit because we think we're about to be battered by PISA international league tables. But the interesting thing is that actually the OECD produced some very interesting work around the vision and values for education. The problem is that the research very rarely gets read. And in 2013, they produced the first ever global report, huge global research document, into the links between education, employability, and skills. And I'm going to share with you now the headlines from the executive summary of that report, because I think they're more relevant now than potentially they've ever been before, as we think about how we can work together once we come through this to build an education system that is really going to support our children in the challenge of the legacy of COVID. And there are 4 key headlines that I want to share with you. The first, that the countries where there's an over-reliance on formal qualifications rather than the development of actual skills are the countries where young people are going to find it increasingly difficult to get jobs. Why? Because, of course, in those countries, we're pressured into focusing on preparing children to take exams and assessments and tests, often at the expense of the really expansive education we want to involve them in. The second and really interesting point is that the findings of the report said that there was a far greater importance now on interpersonal skills rather than on routine cognition in the global workplace. And again, I think that's going to be even more important moving on post-COVID in a world where increasing numbers of our young people are going to be on short-term contracts or even self-employed. And how are we going to make sure that these things take the rightful place front and center of what we're doing in our schools. The third point, which really follows on from that, is that it's vital that people have the ability through their lives to be able to constantly learn, adapt, and change. And again, we're seeing that now more than ever, aren't we? Because people are finding this uncertainty and the sudden shifts in life so incredibly difficult to come to terms with on a personal and professional footing. And the one thing we know is the world is going to continue to turn faster and going to continue to be uncertain. You know, in some ways, this is the second seismic shift in work patterns that we've seen in less than 20 years, you know, with the global financial crisis and now this. And to be honest, we know it's going to be more. And then the final one of the key findings I want to share with you is this one, that there need to be closer links between the worlds of work and the world of education. Now, I've got just a few minutes to wrap before we take some questions. So I just want to finish with two name drops and two very quick stories, which I hope amplify what we're talking about here this evening and through the week. The first is a meeting with this man. This is Barry Barish, who was the 2017 Nobel Prize winner for physics. And the reason I bring him up is because of something he said to me when I asked him about how he went about recruiting the scientists that made it into his Nobel Prize winning team. He had to sift 3,500 serious scientists, world-renowned experts, down to a team that was funded for 138. And I said, and how did you do that? He said, 2 criteria. He said, because they were all incredible scientists. He said, the first was nobody made it onto my team if they only had science in their background. He said, I wanted 3-dimensional, rounded people. So I needed people that had humanities, arts, and the sciences in their background to make it into my research team. And the second thing he said, which I think is just fascinating, is that nobody made it into my team if they didn't have the ability to ask stupid questions. What a brilliant thing to take back into school and discuss, huh? What does it actually take to ask a stupid question? Is there such a thing as a stupid question? And do we promote it both in our colleagues and our children? And that leads me now to my final name drop. And this is my big finish. So sit back, everybody. Again, a while ago, I had the honor and privilege to meet the #1 person on my wish list of people I wanted to meet in my lifetime. I got the opportunity to spend 20 minutes with President Obama. And I've got to tell you, I could talk about it all night, and I haven't got time. But suffice to say, he is everything and more you'd ever want him to be. And I got the chance to ask him one question, and it's a thought that I'm going to leave you with before maybe we go back and take some questions. And it's this. I said, what is the one thing that you think you learned above everything else in your 8 years in the White House? And he said, well, I'll tell you. He said, when I started in the White House, I surrounded myself with probably the world's greatest technical minds, economists, scientists, political thinkers, communication teams. He said, and what I realized on reflection after that 8 years is that virtually none of the problems that crossed his desk, none of the problems that crossed my desk were actually technical by nature. They were human. He said, the problem is our reflex whenever we're dealing with challenge is to find a technical solution first. And actually what I've realized is you have to drill down to the human cause if you're truly going to create a significant and sustainable answer. He said most of those problems to do with love, hate, anger, jealousy, greed, tribalism. He said, and I urge people now to always look for the human core of every problem they're dealing with. And I think really, and forgive me, it's been such a kind of quick burst. That's where I want to end, which is where I began. That as we look to come through both the short-term and long-term impact of our lived experience, that we remember that the solutions have to lie in the humanity first and the technical second. Thank you so much. And I look forward to spending the rest of the evening with you and maybe taking a couple of questions now. Thank you.
Richard, thank you very much. I'm sure there's rapturous applause at laptops and phones across the region right now. If you do have a question for Richard, you can use the Q&A function and send those through, and you can continue to send those through for the rest of the evening. and we'll pick those up. We had a question in from Peter for you. He asked, what are the basics of a good education?
Wow, that's like a doctoral thesis.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I think in a way, the best analogy I can give is that we need our young people almost to be to operate like smartphones in the 21st century. So there are core things they need to be able to do, and those include core skills. We need them to be literate. We need them to be numerate. We need them to be able to understand how to assimilate and challenge information, and to collaborate and to work in teams. Those are kind of givens. And then almost what we need is to have like an app store of opportunity where young people can dip into various things that might be relevant and important to them at various points in their life. But I think really the foundational point is we need to make sure they have the tools and appreciation and confidence to be able to learn through their entire lives and know where and how to find the skills and information they need. But I think above everything, they need to have the confidence to fail, to make mistakes, because that's how we learn, isn't it? You know, you learn nothing new by getting something right. You only ever learn something new from the point of a mistake or the realization you don't know something or you can't do something. And to be able to feel that they can be active and important citizens in their own feeling, in their own lives.
Yeah, brilliant. We have another question here from Deirdre. She said, I totally agree with your vision of the best way to educate students. How can we move from the league tables and dependence on exams to good human skills?
I think what's really important here is, and I don't know how, you know, we've got to stop waiting for politicians to give us permission or to create policy out of this. I think what I've noticed in the decade or so since I left school and spent more and more time in the business community, in elite sport, in the arts, working with organizations around the world, is the only people that seem to believe this traditional methodology is the right way to go are policymakers and the people who surround them. So what I think we need to do is realize actually we have more freedom and opportunity as professionals than we think we do. And I think in small ways, you know, it's tiny steps. Start to exert change in your classroom with your kids as and when you can. I mean, I know it's hard because of the syllabus, because of the focus on outcomes, but there are opportunities. And the more we can do that and the more we can galvanize each other, the more we have a really positive vision and exemplars of that vision to sell to our communities, to parents, to grandparents, to carers, to students themselves. And actually, if we can create momentum that way, change will flow. You know, every year, Ipsos Mori carry out a veracity index, a trust index, where they look at the world's most trusted professions. And every year, without fail, even way before COVID, number one were always doctors and nurses. But just below doctors and nurses for the 10 years this research has been carried out are educators. And right down at the bottom of the list are politicians, and dare I say it in present company, certain journalists. And the thing is this, that we need to understand how trusted the profession are. And if we can construct that positive exemplified vision, people will jump on board. And I think that'll give us the power to change the system over the coming years.
Yeah, brilliant. We've got time for just one more question before we have to move on. It's from Anya. She says, do you see that the way that the school day and school weeks structures have been changing lately? As many will be working from home, do we need to create a truly autonomous learner?
That's a really important point. And I think now more than ever, that's true. I think we absolutely do. And I think actually that begins with trust, because I think to an extent, our education system has been designed and managed top down, on top of us and therefore on top of our children, very much on a very traditional industrial philosophy of an assumption of incompetence. In other words, teachers and school leaders and schools are managed on a belief they'll only do their best if they're micromanaged to do so. To an extent, that level of society and policymaker also believe our children are fundamentally lazy and will only do their best if they're managed to do so. And actually what we have to do is create what I see increasingly in really dynamic and innovative organizations, which is an assumption of excellence, where people assume people will come in every day and want to do their best. And we only manage when people need that level of intervention rather than managing everybody in the same way. And if we can start to do that, then students themselves will become more autonomous, they'll feel more trusted, and they'll learn to self-manage more. And absolutely, more now than ever, we need to trust our communities, our teachers, teaching assistants, our students. And if we can create that environment where they learn to collaborate with one another more, and rather than feeling they're set against each other, I think we can create a really exciting model moving forwards.
Mm-hmm. And it's a change that's happening across so many different areas, not just in education, but obviously it's their future are in all these different areas that are relying on autonomous working as well. So I suppose we need to change education to change their approach to work as well.
Absolutely, because again, it's a great point, David. You know, we know moving forward that more and more companies and organizations in the working world are going to be spending less time in office buildings, even post-COVID. And there is going to be an increase of blended working and more home working. And so we have to prepare young people to be less about being trained to be managed and more about being able to manage themselves.
Very true. Okay, Richard.